coming to you live, Dad. We're live to the people.
Live,
Live to
not
the people.
canned,
Not what?
not canned.
No cans here, man. Just
No,
fresh, live, Allan Lichtman, straight to your dome. Am I right?
that's right. You heard it first.
We are now just a few days post Iowa caucuses, where Donald Trump won, Ron DeSantis got second, Nikki Haley got third, and Vivek got fourth and then dropped out. Dad, what's your initial reaction post Iowa caucuses?
All right, here it is. You ready?
Yes.
There was one winner, one survivor, and three losers. The winner was obviously Donald Trump. It wasn't a matter, as we talked about last week, for Donald Trump to finish first. That was, pretty well decided. What Donald Trump needed was to get over 50%, get a majority, and he did that. Barely, but he still did it. Now, the pundits who we know are wrong at least half the time, so you might as well flip a coin as listen to the pundits have said, well, but if it comes down to one-on-one, the consolidated anti-Trump vote could be close to the Trump vote. And that's errant nonsense. Even if every other candidate dropped out, and we know Vivek has already dropped out, Ron DeSantis dropped out, that does not mean that those who voted for them are all going to vote for Nikki Haley. Or if, Haley drops out and DeSantis is the sole survivor, that doesn't mean Haley's votes are all going to go to DeSantis. That's nonsense. Some of those folks won't vote at all, and some of them will definitely go to Donald Trump. So it's going to take more than just forcing a one-on-one, which doesn't appear to be on the horizon anyway, to derail the Trump locomotive. All right, the three losers. Number one, Nikki Haley. The story going into Iowa was Nikki Haley has great momentum. She looks like she, may not beat Donald Trump early, but could beat him in New Hampshire. She's on the rise. DeSantis is collapsing. He's going to disappear. And instead, the Haley bandwagon slid off an icy road in the state of Iowa. She had a miserable showing, not only finishing behind DeSantis, but only garnering 19% of the vote compared to 51% for Donald Trump. She can spin it, she can huff, and she can puff, but the numbers don't lie. Second big loser, of course, was Ramaswamy, who's now dropped out. Not that anyone really noticed that he dropped out and endorsed Trump, but at least officially he is gone. And the third big loser, of course, were the pundits and the pollsters who, their big story was to hype Nikki Haley, who fell well below expectations. And now, if you believe the polls, which all of these pundits, rely on, live by, she slipped to 15, 16 points behind Donald Trump in the New Hampshire polling. Earlier, before Iowa, she had been single digits behind Donald Trump. And finally, the one survivor is Ron DeSantis. If the story of the pundits going into Iowa was the meteoric rise of Nikki Haley, the other story was the collapse of Ron DeSantis, who was expected to finish a poor third. And in effect, even if he didn't drop out, that his campaign was over. That didn't happen. He didn't get a whole lot of votes, but he beat out Haley. He did finish second, and he beat expectations. And, the whole Iowa thing is way overhyped. Only 1.6% of nearly 25,000 Republican convention delegates are picked in Iowa. So the delegate count is meaningless. The only thing that matters in Iowa is who exceeded expectations in the overall vote and who didn't. And even that is way overhyped, because just talking about a few 100,000 people, a minute fraction of registered voters in the country who actually voted in Iowa. The other really notable thing to come out of the Iowa primaries, I think I mentioned this last time, but I want to stress it again. The most important thing to come out It was the entrance poll, which showed 31% of Iowa caucus Republicans said that if Donald Trump was convicted of a felony, he would not be fit to serve as president. These are the hardcore Republicans, Donald Trump's base, the folks who braved, minus 35 wind chill to show up at a Republican caucus. If, 31% of them are in jeopardy, if Donald Trump is convicted of a felony, that could shake up everything in this election. He can't afford to lose anywhere close to that of the hardcore Republicans like the Iowa Caucus goers, which helps explain Trump's strategy, which is deflect, delay, 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 because he knows if he goes to trial, the evidence is overwhelming. Even the publicly available evidence is overwhelming. And we know the prosecutors have a lot more than what is publicly available. He knows if he goes to trial, his chances of being convicted are pretty high. Now, that doesn't disqualify him for running for president, but as that poll showed, it would make likely a big dent in his base and really put a damper on his presidential hopes. Now, the other tactic that Trump is pursuing, which I also think is the delay tactic because it has no chance, is to go to the courts for the January 6th trial, the one that's barreling closest, supposed to be in early March, and say, I have absolute immunity no matter what I do as president, even commit crimes. And his lawyers, they got caught in a bear trap. Very smart Judge Pan asked the lawyer, could Donald Trump, as part of his official duties, order Team SEAL 6 to shoot all his political opponents and get away with it, be immune? And the lawyer said, yes, unless he is first impeached, as if impeachment, had to precede criminal prosecution, which is absolute nonsense. And all the president has to do is resign before he's impeached and then, go ahead and run again with all his political opponents dead. And by the way, if that's true, then Joe Biden can do all this, just as if Trump's claims that Mike Pence could decide which electoral votes to count or not to count, by that same logic, Kamala Harris could decide, vice president, which votes to count and which votes not to count. Another piece of errant nonsense coming from the Trump team. And Trump is not only in criminal jeopardy. Remember, he was convicted by a civil jury of sexually assaulting, hurting, and defaming E. Jean Carroll. The liability is set. And now there's another trial, which is simply to determine the amount of damages. And Trump can't help himself. He keeps defaming her, even in the courtroom, which caused the judge to tell him to shut up. You can't, talk loudly enough while E. Jean Carroll is testifying for the jury to hear. And his lawyer was just abysmal. She got smacked down any number of times by the judge for not following the proper rules of federal court. She seemed to have no idea what she was doing. I don't really know her, but I've heard that she was a real estate lawyer before she went over to Donald Trump. Donald Trump can't get real lawyers because they don't want to work for him. So he's got to kind of scrape to get lawyers who are not experienced in the kinds of things that he is facing.
I asked you about Iowa, and now we're on a laundry list of Trump transgressions. You always seem to do that. Right, I know they're all tied together, but I don't think people are interested in you reciting a laundry list of Trump's transgressions. I think people are pretty aware, and they want to know what's going to happen with the election and things.
But this is all going to affect the election. This is everything.
But can't you talk about this stuff without going through a laundry list of his transgressions?
The laundry is finished.
All right, going back to my initial question, which was Iowa, not Trump.
I gave you an extended answer.
Yes, you did. Thank you. You said that there was one winner, Donald Trump, and that there was one survivor, Ron DeSantis. Don't you think
and
that...
3 losers.
You're right, and 3 losers. But don't you think that Ron DeSantis was a winner because so many people were counting him out and he did so much better than expected? And if Trump does get convicted and they go to the runner-up, then he's the nominee. So that's huge. That win in Iowa, or that second place finish in Iowa, could be a huge win for him, not just a surviving win.
Yeah, I don't buy that. Even if Trump blows up, it's not necessarily true that they're going to go to the second place winner in Iowa who got 21% of the vote. There are a whole series of, much bigger primary contests in states that have vastly more delegates at stake, vastly more voters than Iowa. And most of them are going to come down before there's any Trump trial. At the earliest, Trump trial is going to take place in March. It's going to last months. So the bulk of the primary is going to be over, even under the most optimistic circumstances, before there's a verdict in any Trump criminal trial. There will be a verdict in Trump's civil trial that could destroy his business in New York, and that could hurt him. The judge said he's going to rule by the end of this month.
Okay. So I see what you're saying. What's your forecast looking forward to the next couple primaries, New Hampshire and South Carolina?
I still see Trump winning both of those primaries. If Haley had done better in Iowa and sustained, the pundit narrative, then I think she had a shot in New Hampshire. And then you go to South Carolina, which is her home state, but also, a very conservative Republican state with a lot of the Trump base. So at this point, I really don't see either Haley or certainly not DeSantis pushing the Trump train off the tracks.
Now, earlier you also mentioned that you said 30% of Iowa caucus voters said they wouldn't support Trump if he was convicted. But isn't that just more of the same? Haven't Republican voters said in the past they wouldn't support him if he did this, if he did that, if he did this, if he did X, if he did Y? And he's still crushing in the Republican Party. So and like you said, you don't trust polls. Can't they just turn around once he gets convicted and say, well, I'm going to vote for him because I don't like Biden and I only have Biden or Trump to vote for? And then Trump is still surging.
This is different. Those polls you're talking about were general polls. They were not polls of Trump's base. What makes this different is these were actual voters, not, registered voters, not all adults, not some guess about likely voters. And these were the hardcore Republican voters. I'm not saying all 31% are going to turn away from Trump, but even if half of them do, even if a third of them do, this is a base that Trump has to hold 90% plus to win the general election.
I hear what you're saying, but I don't know. Trump seems to still garner a ton of popularity and a ton of support in the midst of unspeakable transgressions.
But
he hasn't been
criminally convicted, and that's different.
Right.
That sets everything else apart.
Yeah. I would have thought that, once he sowed doubt in our entire election system, once he encouraged his supporters to charge to the Congress, once he sent fake electors, that would have done it. But it seems like nothing does it. So I don't know, man. I'm not bought into.
I didn't think anything would do it either. That's why I was so startled by that poll. I would not have thought it would be anything close to 31%.
That's why I don't buy it.
Hardcore Republicans.
That's kind of why I don't
Those
buy
other
it.
polls are not the hardcore Republicans.
I see what you're saying.
This is by far and away the best poll because it's the hardcore Republicans. It's real voters. It's folks, as I said, who braved minus 35 temperatures in the wind chill to go to these caucuses. Now, it's a small sample, on the other hand, but it's still a pretty telling statistic. As I say, even if half or a third break with Trump, he can't afford that.
See what you're saying? I guess we'll have to wait and find out as we keep having to do with Trump. I don't know. Me personally, just my own thought process, I don't think Trump can win a general election even as today. But it is kind of concerning just from a standpoint of our democracy and our electorate to think that he's still so popular after trying to destroy our entire election process. That's really concerning to me.
Well, you got to understand, his supporters don't believe that. and they're impervious to any evidence and arguments to the contrary that contradict their beliefs. Not that they analyze the evidence and find it wanting. They don't even consider it. They dismiss it off the top. It's the deep state. It's the socialists. It's Joe Biden.
So why wouldn't they do the same thing for these?
Consider any contrary evidence.
Right. So why wouldn't they do the same thing when it comes to these convictions? Why wouldn't they just say, oh, the judge was against Trump. The evidence they used was from the deep state. They could use the exact same logic for all these.
Much, much harder because these folks are also, you got to remember, law and order people. And yeah, you can say it's all made up. It doesn't mean anything, but it's a little harder to do that when you're dealing with a criminal conviction. And remember, the judge does not make the decision. It's the jury.
True, but the jury doesn't vote.
In one of the cases, it's a Florida jury.
Right, but the juries aren't the ones that are going to be deciding the election.
But the juries are the ones who are going to be convicting, and it's much harder to dismiss a jury conviction. You know, in the civil case about his New York business, it's one judge, and it's much easier to attack one judge than to go after a jury. Remember, 70% still wouldn't be moved even by a felony conviction. But my point is, even though it's a minority, he can't afford to lose any of those people.
Yeah, I just feel like, again, you know, we heard the same thing. You know, when the January 6th committee airs on TV and the nation sees it spelled out.
You didn't hear any of that from me. You didn't. Well, it's the same pundits who are always wrong.
Okay.
Remember, I was the one who stood out and took all the flack in 2016 for predicting Trump's win. When everyone else was saying, oh, he's dead, he can't withstand the Access Hollywood tape and all the accusations and the Russians, he's finished. In fact, the head of the eminent Princeton consortium, Sam Wang, said, we are so convinced, 99% plus, that Hillary Clinton is going to win, that I'll eat a bug on national television if she loses. And to his credit, he did eat a bug on CNN.
Yeah. I guess I don't know. I'm still skeptical that these cases, even if convicted, are gonna hurt him. But like you said, even a little bit of a ding can make a big difference.
And let's not forget, I don't predict elections from that stuff. I predict elections based on the keys. And right now there is no call on the keys. So
good point.
We'll see.
Very good point. Should we start getting to some questions, Dad?
I certainly hope we have some.
Oh, we have some, sir. Oh, we got some, man. Don't you worry about a thing. Terry Green.
We have some about presidents out there?
Yes, there's some presidents in here. I definitely see President.
I'm impressed.
We got President Belichick. We got President Abraham Lincoln. Those are two I see right off the bat. But let's get to some questions. Terry Green with a $5 donation. Thank you, Terry. They say, why is the media making pretend that Haley has a shot at overtaking Trump for the nomination?
Number one, the media has no idea. It's sports talk radio. You know, they don't know how elections really work. Their predictions, you know, they're kind of fun, but they don't mean a thing. You know, as we saw in 2016, how horribly wrong they were. A lot of them were wrong in 2012, calling Mitt Romney when Obama won in a near landslide. So forget all that. But why are they doing this? Because they want a story. If the story is, you know, no one's going to touch Trump, he's going to sail to the nomination, then there's no drama, no story. So they've got to drum up a story, and it's easy enough to do it with the polls. You don't even have to get out of bed in the morning to write a story about the polls. So it's all about ratings and having stories. I don't blame them. I understand that. And as I said, I like sports talk radio. I put zero credence in it, but it's fun. Same thing with political punditry.
Right. Elon Musk T with a $10 donation. Thank you for the question, but we've discussed that.
I thought Elon Musk can give us $10 million.
I thought so too. But we've discussed that in past episodes, so I'd encourage you to look back about that question. Will Strumeyer says, I know you don't have a key about vice presidential candidates, but if Trump picked Nikki Haley as his VP, could it potentially have an impact on the election since his base doesn't like her?
Uh, Vice presidents have no predictive value. Back in 1988, a lot of the pundits were saying, oh my God, George H.W. Bush picked this lightweight, Dan Quayle, who suffered perhaps the worst drubbing in a vice presidential debate, except for Ross Perot's vice presidential pick, but that's third party. And it made absolutely no difference. As I predicted, H.W. Bush won running away. A lot of people thought Dick Cheney was a terrible pick. He added nothing. He's, about as charismatic as an old shoe. Didn't affect the results of that election. So we've seen no indication predictively that vice presidential candidates matter. That's why I don't have a key for it.
Right. Mike DeNicola asked, do you think the whole Hunter Biden agreeing to deposition for the impeachment inquiry, along with Biden family interviews, will cause Dems to acknowledge a scandal that would flip the no scandal key?
Not at all. As far as we know, and they've been investigating this not just for months, but for years. Even Bill Barr, the loyal attorney general for Donald Trump, couldn't find anything on Joe Biden. Just because Hunter Biden may have done things wrong doesn't mean Joe Biden did, any more than when Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter's brother, did things wrong. In no way did that mean that Jimmy Carter wasn't, this incredibly moral, upright person.
George Miller wants to know, they paid I think it's Malaysian dollars to know our heights. But I think we're going to pass on that, George. Appreciate the donation, but
Yeah.
Miles Wolf wants to know, can you talk about why Biden is not on the ballot in New Hampshire?
Yeah. They wanted to move the whole schedule, to move away from small, overwhelmingly white states to begin the process. And New Hampshire wouldn't cooperate. And so Biden boycotted the New Hampshire primary, although he could still be written in. But again, a minuscule number of delegates is being selected. It's only a beauty contest.
Elemental Bot says, since Israel and Ukraine don't look great for a foreign policy victory at the moment, what else could affect that key?
No, I agree completely. The key looks very, very shaky in Ukraine and the Middle East, but you never know with wars, they can change very, very quickly. So I haven't made a call yet. And then the other thing, there are a couple of other things that could affect it. Is China going to go after Taiwan? I don't think so. They've been talking about it for decades and have never done it. And Taiwan, I've been there. They're no pushovers. They have an incredible economy, an amazingly strong military. And of course, there could be a much wider war in the Middle East. We've already seen America engaging in acts of war in attacking the Houthi rebels in Yemen. We've seen Pakistan and Iran engaging in acts of war. If a major war breaks out in the Middle East, then all bets are off in terms of how that could affect the keys.
Joe Walsh says, I think the 2024 U.S. election is probably the most important election since the one with Abraham Lincoln versus McClellan. What do you think, Dad?
I think there's a lot to that. I have to say, every 4 years we hear how important the election is. 2020, most important election ever. Are we going to give Trump another 4 years and, risk our democracy or not? But I do think there's a lot of truth to that, although there were some other pretty critical elections. For example, 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover, ended the era of conservative Republican domination and began the onset of New Deal reform legislation that still things like Social Security, the Securities and Exchange Commission, child labor laws, insurance of banking deposits that are still, these New Deal reforms, still the pillars of our political economy.
A $20 donation from David Paquin. Thank you so much, David. We appreciate that. Stevie asks, do you think Lauren Boebert will win re-election in the new districts of Colorado?
Well, she moved into a pretty Republican district, so I'd say the odds are in her favor. I don't know what kind of primary challenge she may face, though. That could hurt her chances or even knock her off the ballot.
Barry Smith asks, hypothetical question. I support.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. I support.
Uh-oh.
Let me finish, man. I support incumbent X. However, the Keys have gone against him. Should I still go out and vote for him, or should I not bother?
The Keys are based on politics sort of following precedent. You know, as I've said many times, though Sam disagrees, I don't have a crystal ball or a line upstairs. The Keys are based on history. And if you start changing patterns based on the Keys, you're changing history. So absolutely you should vote. And who knows, maybe after 40 years, the next time the Keys will be wrong. I don't think so, but I'm not so arrogant to say I could never, ever possibly be wrong. And I'm getting old, and sharp young people like Sam have to take over.
Take over what?
The Keys.
I don't know anything. David Albine asks, we've talked about this before, but I'm curious what you think today, Dad, because it's an ever-changing environment out there. They ask, Allan, do you think the Supreme Court will rule on the immunity case?
No, I don't. I think the D.C. Court of Appeals, the three-judge panel, will unanimously and very powerfully strike down the immunity case of Donald Trump. I don't think the full Court of Appeals will want to hear it. And I don't think the Supreme Court will take it up. Here's the one thing about the Supreme Court. They've been very conservative about substantive issues like abortion rights or guns or regulation. But they've avoided all the presidential election cases. They didn't take up any of the 2020 cases. They didn't stop information from going to the January 6th committee. They do not want to get involved in this election contest. It's a no-win for them. If they decide for Trump, then the story will be, oh, they're just a bunch of Republican tools. If they decide against Trump, then they're going to incur the ire of Republicans and conservatives. So I think they'll let the DC Court of Appeals ruling, which I'm confident will go against Trump, stand.
Iron Axle Animation.
I don't have a system for that. That's my gut.
Iron Axle Animation asks, what do you make of the pundits saying Biden is weaker than Obama? But Obama lost over 700 legislative seats in his first term, while under Biden, Dems have gained and flipped state houses.
Very smart analysis. Again, the pundits don't know what they're talking about. That's errant nonsense. He lost all of those legislative seats, and he lost control of both houses of Congress in 2010 and 2014. And then his successor was Donald Trump, whereas Biden has been much more successful electorally. In 2022, they actually gained a Senate seat, amazingly, and really dampened the usual midterm losses for the party holding the White House, with Republicans very narrowly gaining control of the House, whereas a lot of the pundits, again, were predicting, a much bigger sweep for Republicans. So there is no basis in fact, as our viewer very smartly points out, for saying politically Biden is less successful than Obama. I've said many times, Obama was an excellent president substantively and a terrible president politically.
Stephen G says, this guy is a Trump hater. Why don't you talk about Biden's mess? Any response, Dad?
Which mess are we talking about?
That's what they say.
I have no idea what you're talking. Inflation is now down to 3%. It was 11% when he started. He's created more jobs than any other president. Real wages are going up. Crime is down, even though the federal government has very little to do with crime. So I'm not sure what mess you're talking about. If you want to identify something, I'll respond.
Jim Blowers says, if Haley or Christie runs on the no labels line, would that take down Key 4 if she gets 5%? Or would this be a split in the Republican Party?
Clearly, it would be a split in the Republican Party, which is very rare for the out party to split. Almost never happens, but that would be a rarity. And I think it's incredibly unlikely that either one of them is going to do that. Haley's going to probably take it to the convention, by which time it'll be way too late to run a third party campaign. I mean, it's not impossible, but it'll be very, very hard. I think, again, it's remote, but more likely is if, Donald Trump somehow gets derailed, that he would run an independent or third party campaign because he doesn't care about other Republicans.
Ezra Kirkpatrick asks, are you worried about the failures of the Republican Party? While it's right for GOP to fail in elections/fundraising because of their democracy issues, in the longer term, we need differing opinions.
Completely agree. We need a more responsible Republican Party. Look what, they finally got a majority in the House. And what have they spent their time doing? Trying to impeach Joe Biden, trying to go after Hunter Biden, who's a private citizen, who's never held any public office. They've done nothing substantively with the very narrowly divided Senate to really advance the agenda. And look at Trump. He promised big infrastructure, right? Delivered zero. He promised a better healthcare bill than the Affordable Care Act. He promised that way back in the 2020 campaign. Almost 4 years later, there still is no healthcare plan coming out of Donald Trump. They talk a lot about inflation, but I haven't seen any Republican plans to curb inflation. In fact, they're talking about big tax cuts, which are going to increase, not decrease inflation. And they're talking about, balancing the budget, while at the same time, they're talking about greatly increasing military spending and cutting taxes. So I do think the country does need a more substantive Republican Party, not one that's, relying on these hot button cultural issues.
The Alex Treefire asks, could Trump actually pull us out of the Constitution if elected?
Not impossible. I mean, not formally, but the president has enormous power. Imagine if, in fact, the case on immunity went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yes, Trump, any president has absolute immunity. Then Trump wouldn't have to worry about the Constitution. And he's already said, I can do anything I want as president, echoing the notorious statement of Richard Nixon in 1977, when he said, if the president does it, it's not illegal. And that it created a firestorm of criticism back then, and Trump's repeated it. And he's even said, if necessary, I will suspend the Constitution. Not that he can do that in reality, in principle, but he conceivably could do that in practice. Now, that said, we do have some pretty strong guideposts, guardrails against any one individual suspending, undermining, destroying the Constitution. We do have the courts, which, as I said, have not been, just in Trump's pocket on these electoral issues. We have state governments, we have the House, we have the Senate. I'm not saying it's impossible to override all that, but we do have some pretty strong guardrails in place. I also wrote a book on this called 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump, in which I talked about ways in which we could strengthen the guardrails of our democracy.
For Menta What with a $5 donation, thank you so much for the donation. They ask, people have been saying Trump's overall health has been getting worse. Look at his hand the other day. It almost looked like it had 3 blisters.
I'm asked about Biden's health. I'm asked about Trump's health all the time. And my answer is, I have a PhD, not an MD. And I'm really not competent to comment on health issues. Although I have to say, back when I was on tic-tac-toe with Wink Martindale in 1981, Wink kept confusing the two and kept asking me, what my advice was about his sore shoulder. And I kept trying to explain I'm not that kind of doctor. It took about a week or so for that to sink in.
How many people in the chat know who Wink Martindale is? Put a thumbs
They
up.
probably will think he's a football coach.
Not the football coach, the old quiz show guy.
And the football coach took his nickname from the old quiz show host when I was on Wink Martindale, so that the football coach is not actually named Wink, but he took on that name. I don't even know what his real first name is, to say the truth.
Well, put a thumbs up in the chat if you know who Wink Martindale is, the game show guy. Put a thumbs down if you don't know who it is. Nietzsche says, you say forget polls. Is there a caveat where if late election year polls are in favor of the president by X percentage point that correlate with your keys?
Well, I still would go with the keys and say, the polls confirm them. But the truth is, these days, the days of landslide elections are over. We haven't had a landslide election really since 1984, when candidate gets 60 or close to 60% of the vote. It's very difficult these days because of the extreme polarization between the two parties. But I have to say, even late election polls could be wrong. We have the notorious 1948 election when every single poll said Tom Dewey was going to beat Harry Truman. And Chicago Daily News, following that, quickly jumped on the election and said, Dewey defeats Truman, a headline that Truman would hold up in glee. The latest Gallup poll in 2012, not way back when, had Romney slightly ahead, and Romney lost big to Barack Obama in 2012. So even late election polls, I think I mentioned last time, in June of 1988, just a few months before the election, George H.W. Bush trailed Michael Dukakis by 17 to 18 points. And he won by about 6 or 7 for a nearly 25-point swing.
Patrick Murray with a $2 donation. They say, you see Trump running in 28, even if he wins in 24. Strange question, but he donated, so I asked.
You can't. We have a 2-term limit under the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution.
Right.
He can only try to run again in 2028 if he loses. And he will not be in a very good position, particularly when all the Republicans are challenging Biden's age, that Trump would be over 80 in 2028.
Max Bocherat with a £5 or €5, I'm not sure which one that is, donation. They say
£5 is actually more than $5.
That's true. They say it's pound, I believe. They say, love the podcast. You mentioned the keys aren't weighted. Yet the way you talk about a possible conviction, it's like the challenger key is weighted.
That's an excellent point. But, maybe I haven't made it clear today, but I've made it clear many times. A conviction for a felony, it's outside the scope of the keys. It's something that the keys cannot take into account because it's never happened. And the keys obviously are based on historical patterns. And I was not putting that conviction so much in the context of a general election, but the fact that it could derail the nomination. I've talked about this before, that even if the conviction comes after Trump has a majority of the delegates, the convention or the Republican National Committee, and I'm not an expert on internal Republican rules, but I believe they can do this. They can decide they do not want to have a nominee, saddled with conviction and maybe even a prison sentence, even though that doesn't make him legally ineligible. And they could bounce Trump, and then all bets are off. Who knows who they might pick? It's not going to be you, Sam, because you're not old enough.
How do you know? Oh, damn it. You're right. Shoot.
Right.
Rats.
Yeah, sorry.
Ish.
Could be me.
Could be.
I'm way old enough.
True.
I'm old enough for 2 candidacies.
Right. Ish on Belmont says, Professor Lichtman, what do you think about North Carolina and Florida not holding Democratic primaries and just picking Biden?
I don't like it, but it doesn't really matter. There's no real challenge to Biden. Nobody knows who Dean Phillips or Marianne Williamson is. Uh, it's almost impossible, even with a strong candidate, to knock off an incumbent. Ted Kennedy, the great Ted Kennedy, couldn't knock off a very weak president, Jimmy Carter. The great Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 could not knock off a very weak president, William Howard Taft. It just doesn't happen.
Sweet Seller asks, what would have happened what would have been the outcome of your keys if there was no Watergate in the 72 election?
I don't answer questions like that because you
right.
cannot yank one event out of history and assume everything else would remain the same. Watergate affected all kinds of things, including the midterm elections. So who knows what history would have been without Watergate? Something would have to fill it in. You don't have an empty space in history. That's why I don't yank things out of context like that.
Nitsky says, Bibi saying the war could go to 2025. Key flipping.
It's possible. I've said this before. It's ironic that Biden is bearing the brunt of all of Netanyahu's bad policies when Netanyahu was pumped up by conservative Republicans. He was their darling. He's, the Israeli Donald Trump. In my view, Israel could not have a worse leader at this critical time in Israeli and world history. And even the Israeli public, at least if you believe the polls, his approval rating is much worse than Joe Biden's. But they're not going to hold an election in the middle of a war, although they could, because under their parliamentary system, you could have a vote of no confidence at any time and hold an election at any time. And Netanyahu is prime minister by the skin of his teeth, by cobbling together, a coalition of some very far right-wing Israeli parties.
We just got a $50 donation from Jeff Crusan. Thank you so much. Give him a round of applause. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. That keeps us going.
Gotta wait for Allan to put his Diet Coke down, or Diet Pepsi.
Yes.
Sometimes
this is Diet Coke this time. I'm an equal opportunity addict.
Right. Jeff says, sometimes I don't know what to think of Biden's handling of Israel/Gaza. He's not perfect, but it seems to me like sometimes the best job a president can do is just to make sure it doesn't get worse. What can you say to ease my mind on this troubling subject? Well, that's a lot to ask of him, so I guess the $50 was warranted.
Oh my God. You're absolutely right. Politically, there is no good path for Biden. If he comes down too hard on Israel, you're going to have all of the anti-Semites, even lots of people who aren't anti-Semites, but think Israel has come down too hard on Gaza, turn against him. If he comes down too hard on the side of the Palestinians, then not only the Jewish vote, but a lot of people who have a lot of sympathy for Israel will come down on him. So probably at this point, he steered it about as well as he could, because there is no good answer politically for Joe Biden in this crisis. This is not a new crisis. This has been going on since, the war right after World War II between, the Israelis and the Arabs, and subsequent wars and intifadas and conflicts and settlements. And, way back 75 years ago, Dwight Eisenhower said, nothing will ever get settled in the Middle East until the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians gets settled, and it has no military answer. And by the way, for all this posturing of the Arab world about the poor Palestinians, for a time, Jordan and Egypt controlled most of the territory held by the Palestinians. And what did they do for the Palestinians? Absolutely nothing. And, as I said many times, instead of buying 1,000 Rolls Royces, the uber rich Saudis could have done so much more for the Palestinians. But I don't know if this is true, but I've heard experts in the Middle East, of which I am not one, say the Arabs don't want to solve the crisis. They want to keep it alive as a wedge issue against Israel.
For Meta What asks, does Fox News tell the truth about Biden?
I don't watch Fox News, so I can't say, but I would be surprised if they do. They certainly didn't tell remotely the truth about the 2020 election. They got sued and had to pay something in the order of $780 million to settle the suit. So they're known for not telling the truth when it comes to politics.
I'll take $700 million.
You would take $780 million?
Yeah, I'll take
Hey,
it.
you would take $78.
That's true. I would take $78. Captain M90s with a $2 donation. I take $2.
Oh, yeah, better.
They say, what trigger foreign policy key in Ukraine/Israel?
Well, obviously, if the Russians make advances in Ukraine and the Congress keeps bollocking up aid, that could be a foreign policy failure. And, a continuing ongoing war in the Middle East that kills, thousands of civilians and seems to solve nothing could be a foreign policy failure. Then, heaven forbid, again, I'm not a military expert, but some of the military experts are saying, what's going on with Pakistan and Iran and the US and the Houthis could spark a wider war in the Middle East, which would be, a humanitarian and economic disaster for the country and the world.
I have my own question, Dad. You see a lot of people, a lot of Trump supporters saying that it was more peaceful under Trump and that under Biden, a lot of global conflicts have arisen. What do you say to that?
I think there's some truth to that, but I don't think these global conflicts are because of Biden. As I said, a lot of the problems in the Middle East are because of Netanyahu, who was pumped up by Donald Trump and the conservative Republicans, not by Biden and the liberals.
Stevie wants to
And
know.
if Trump had been president, I believe. Hey, I'm old. You got to give me a minute to gather all my thoughts.
Yeah, but when you ask me a question, you buzz me right away.
Yeah, at least Froggy's not buzzing you.
Oh, God. Stevie wants to know when.
If Trump had been president, I think Putin would own Ukraine and would be going on to NATO countries.
Stevie wants to know, when did Christianity become entangled with republicanism? Did Reagan have anything to do with that?
When did what become entangled?
Christianity.
Oh, that goes way back. You got to read my book. I have a book on all these things. You got to read them. It's called White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement. And Christianity, Protestant Christianity, became deeply enmeshed in Republican conservative politics right after World War I, when you had this influx of, starting in the late 19th century, of the so-called new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who were heavily Jewish and heavily Catholic. And the most important policy initiative of the conservative Republicans who owned politics in the 1920s was severe immigration restriction. They had quotas for Europe, which were minimal for Eastern and Southern Europe. Lithuania, Poland, Russia, Italy, with large populations, had a quota that was no bigger than that of the UK.
Mark Klein asked a question. They donated $10. We've talked about this before, but I'll pose it to you because they donated. The media is talking about Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom becoming the Democratic nominee. Would the Dems lose the incumbency if Biden or Harris is not the nominee? How could that affect other keys?
They would definitely lose the incumbency key, and they'd lose the party battle key if Michelle Obama and Gavin Newsom battled it out for the Democratic nomination. And given some of the other very precarious keys, they would probably lose the election. This is, again, the fallacy of punditry. They don't know how elections really work, and they make recommendations that are absolutely counterproductive. I give a lot of talks on the keys, and I always start my talk with a pop quiz because I'm a professor. And it's so easy that nobody really has to answer it. That is, have you read or heard something about this election, in the media? And my response is, take all of that and do with it what the great philosopher David Hume said you should do with works of superstition. Consign them to the flames.
The Flames?
The flames, burn them up.
Oh, gotcha. Adam Base with their first super chat. Thank you so much, Adam. They say, would the third party key be false if all the combined candidates get more than 5%? Or does it have to be one candidate that gets over 5%? I'm asking in the case of someone like RFK Jr. if they can't get on the ballot.
It depends on, exactly who those candidates are and whether they represent the same things. That almost never happens. So, I really haven't thought about it recently, but it's a very good question.
Julie asks, hi, Professor, is there a Democratic wave building for 2024? Dems have been outperforming midterm and special election polls by 9 to 11% since the overturn of Roe versus Wade. Dems are energized.
I think, I don't have a system beyond the presidency, but if you disregard, the horse race polls and just look at the results of elections in 2022 and in the off-year elections of 2023, you're absolutely right. Dems have been overperforming, and these are, of course, non-presidential elections, and to a significant extent, that is because of the abortion issue, which used to be kind of a conservative issue, not because more people were anti-abortion, but because the anti-abortion voters were more energized. Now the pro-choice voters are more energized, and they represent a majority. So I do think there is some truth to what the caller says.
Caller?
Watcher, viewer.
Viewer, chatter.
Viewer.
There's no phones involved here. Do you understand that or no?
Oh, well, not really. I'm an old dinosaur.
Right. Andrew.
I go back before, radio, television,
right,
print, we were chiseling things on stone.
Right. Andrew Aylerger, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is Florida in play for Biden?
Hard to say. I mean, you would think no, but you just had a surprise election in a House district in Florida that flipped, and not by a small margin, a reasonable margin to the Democrats. And that one article I read called it a political earthquake in Florida because nobody expected the Democrats to do well. So while you would probably say no, as the great British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli once said, finality is not a word we use in politics.
Theo Meal asks, if Biden gets seriously ill, would you consider that something that would likely break the keys in the way a Trump conviction could?
It could. I mean, depending on how seriously ill he was. What I would suggest in that case, they don't listen to me, is he should resign, let Kamala become president.
Kamala. I've corrected. Not camel.
Kamala.
Like comma.
Yeah.
Kamala.
Kamala become president. How's that?
Good.
And hold on to the key.
Dejindarine says, in the 2016 election, why was the no scandal key true?
What scandal was there in the Obama administration? It was about as squeaky clean an administration as you could possibly get. I wrote an article about that in James Banner edited book on presidential scandals. I wrote the Obama chapter, and not a single Obama official was convicted of anything in 8 years. It's just an amazing record.
Well, the deep state was protecting them, duh.
The African-American guy came out of nowhere as the darling. Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, let me clear something up. The way Trump and his followers regard the deep state is entirely wrong. The idea of the deep state was actually developed by liberal critics of people like Donald Trump, people who were making big political contributions and in turn owning are officials of government. And Donald Trump himself has bragged, yeah, I give them all this money and they do whatever I want. That's the deep state. The deep state is not some bureaucrat sitting in the basement of the Federal Aviation Administration.
Do you believe that Ukraine is already losing the war? And what type of advances would Russia have to make to constitute a military failure and flip that key? Wow, a lot of foreign policy questions tonight.
Yeah, again, I'm not a military analyst.
Yes, you are. You are a military analyst now, okay? As I said so.
I was drafted, so maybe I am. Russia has not won the war. The war at the moment is stalemated, and Russia has performed way below expectations. Those who claim to be military analysts, a lot of them were talking about, this great power, Russia, just steamrolling the puny Ukraine and, rolling into Kyiv. And of course, none of that has happened. And, I can't forecast in advance, what it would take to turn the key one way or the other, but we'll know it when we see it.
80 Mart asked, could there be an extra hidden key turned against a president who has already had the keys turned against them since this election is unprecedented?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The hidden key turned against which way? Against Biden?
Yeah.
I don't think so. And I don't see that. And there are no hidden keys. Every 4 years, someone says to me, oh, there's a hidden key. We have an African-American running, that never had that before. You got to change the keys. So we now have social media. We never had that before. You have to change the keys. And my answer is always the same. The keys, at least retrospectively, go all the way back to the election of Abe Lincoln and the horse and buggy days of our politics. They've survived huge changes, and they've survived predictably, frankly, longer than I expected. For 40 years. So I don't randomly ad hoc change the keys.
Barry Smith asked, does Biden have a robust foreign policy success?
I haven't seen one yet.
It's
still possible it could happen in Ukraine, but I haven't seen it.
Crazy Zoo Lady with their first super chat. Thank you so much, Crazy Zoo Lady. We love zoos. Well, actually,
we sure do. Well, kind of. We like the modern zoos.
Yeah.
We have habitats instead of animals in cages.
And
the zoos are important for breeding and surviving endangered species.
Right. How many books have you written? And if you were to buy your top 3 favorites, or if they were to buy your top 3 favorites, which ones should they get?
I've written 13 books. My all-time favorite is not one of the most popular books. It's a 600-page historical tome, and that is White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement. Second, of course, has to be The Keys, which is now in its 7th edition, Predicting the Next President, 2020. And I'm hard-pressed to say the third one. I would divide it between FDR and the Jews, which I wrote with my colleague, Richard Brightman, and 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump.
Marcellus Wallace, the famed character from Pulp Fiction, asks, what are the keys right now? What are the current keys right now for 2024? That's the question everybody wants answered.
I haven't answered that. I can't answer that. Too many are in flux. I can tell you, with Biden running, they win the contest key and the incumbency key, and they win the policy change key. And of course, there's no Ronald Reagan running on the Republican side. So they do win those 4 keys, but most of the other keys are up for grabs. They've, of course, lost the midterm election key and the incumbent charisma key.
Jamie Smith wants to know, why didn't Hillary Clinton's emails count as a scandal, considering she was in Obama's cabinet at one point?
She was in Obama's cabinet, but the scandal never touched upon the president. When you read my book, you'll see it can't just be a subordinate. Plus, it wasn't really a scandal. Yeah, she made a big mistake, but she never got indicted for it. It didn't undermine the national security. It was mostly a political issue, but it didn't touch the president. Obama had nothing to do with it. And a scandal has to touch the president.
Ben Weinberg with the $5 donation, but then they redacted their message. So,
well, we'll still take the donation. And we're about done for the night, I think. Maybe two more questions.
Okay, so Pamela Mayer with a $5 donation. Thank you, Pamela. Ichis with a $5 donation, their first donation. Thank you so much. Carter lost the foreign policy failure key, but was the Iran hostage crisis really his fault or just bad luck?
A little bit of both. He was very weak on foreign policy, and he organized a disastrous rescue attempt, one of the worst botched military operations in U.S. history that resulted in helicopters and planes crashing, loss of some American lives, and then it even got to the place where the hostages were being held.
Ben England with a $4.
By the way, it's not clear the line between bad luck and bad policy. As Herbert Hoover, a guy who should know, once said, the president gets the credit for the sunshine and the blame for the rain.
Ben England asks, if the incumbent died in October, we've talked about this many times, Ben. If the incumbent dies, the VP takes over, they still get the incumbency key.
Yes, the VP is then president, just like they got it when Gerald Ford became president or Lyndon Johnson became president.
Right. Ben Weinberg is back without a redacted question. They say, should Democrats be worried about Biden's low poll numbers? Obama led Romney in 2012.
Not true. A lot of the polls had Romney ahead of Obama in 2012, and Obama confounded the polls and won going away. Yes, of course, the Democrats would like to see Biden's approval ratings higher, but if they don't turn keys, then they don't affect the election. I'm not saying they can't turn keys. They can, because low approval ratings makes it more difficult to govern, and governance counts, not campaigning.
Just Dini with
Last question.
Just Dini with a $2 donation. Thank you so much. Last question. I don't like asking two questions. Let's see. I'm gonna ask one of them. Will Don Jr. run in 2028? I think
He might try. I don't think he'll get anywhere. I'll take one more question.
One more question? Okay, one more question, guys. We are holding for one more question. Put them in the chat if they're burning. If you need them answered from the one, the only, Allan Lichtman. How was that, Dad?
That was really good, and I didn't pay you a cent for that.
I know. Well, they've been donating all night, so.
That's true. All right, we have no more questions. We're done.
Okay. Well, let's give them a second. They're on a bit of a delay, so let's give them a second.
Remind them to like us.
Oh, right.
To subscribe.
Right.
And to donate. Have we hit 3,000 subscribers?
Yes, we hit 3,000 subscribers. That's a big goal for us.
We're going for 5.
Yes, now we're headed to 5,000. Well, actually, we're headed to 4 and then 5,000. So, Dad,
4 becomes before 5.
Yeah, so you count like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. Okay. I kind of lost track of the questions. Let's see.
I think it's time for a wrap.
Let's wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Dad, do you have any final thoughts on Iowa and the primaries moving forward?
Yes, and I'm not going to digress.
Oh, yes.
Iowa suggests nothing's going to stop the Trump train from running down the tracks, but it does have some warning that down the road, if he's convicted, that could undermine his quest for the Republican nomination. And right now, both Haley and DeSantis survive. DeSantis survives because he turned around the narrative. Haley survives because she's still, despite a disappointing finish in Iowa, the darling of the media. But if Trump wins New Hampshire, it's pretty much all over.
And with that, we say good night. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of this stream. See you next week.
Thank you. Good night and happy dreams.